So if Armin's talking about preferences, one way to think about what I'm going to talk about is, in some sense, the absence of preferences. So choices that are not consistent with a utility function, not consistent with a very standard model. So just by way of background, a very standard approach in economics is that when you see different people making different choices, there's a host of explanations that are possible. Okay, so it could be that they face different constraints. And even when we're talking about different people, it could actually be the same person at different points in time. That's also interesting. So you made a different choice yesterday than you did before, and different from today. It must be that you either face different constraints over those time periods, you have different preferences over those time periods, you have different information or different beliefs. Okay, those are the standard sources of variation in choices in a whatever econ 101 kind of world. From my perspective, economics has changed in recent years, actually led by people in this room. And this is mostly in empirical literature, but that literature is now allowing for another source, as if we needed another source. Makes life more difficult. But we're allowing for another source of variation in choices, another reason why people or the same person over time would make a different choice. And I'm calling that decision-making ability. And so there's a host of papers, and I think Andrew has been really a leader in this area. He may not want to claim it, but I would offer it. A whole host of mostly empirical papers providing evidence of what I think of as a wedge between what people actually choose and what they would have chosen in a kind of idealized circumstance, roughly speaking. Simple version of it is there are many circumstances under which people seem to leave money on the table, would be the Chicago expression, I think. Okay. Long list. Summary. Certain skills or certain knowledge seem to facilitate what I will call better decisions. Okay, so before you get into an uproar about what do you mean by better, I'll get to a definition of better, although I think there should be many. What that means in the way I'm going to talk about it is actual choices may not match true objectives. Let me just give you, by way of background or something, to fix ideas. It is reasonable to assume that everybody likes more money over less, other things equal. Just give me more money, I'm certainly not worse off. It's also reasonable to expect that people like everything else equal, less risk rather than more. Okay? It's not crazy to make those kinds of assumptions. And now I'm going to offer each of you the variance-covariance matrix of the international stock markets, and I'd like you to make choices of a portfolio from that variance-covariance matrix of the realizations of these assets and map them into your natural objective, which is to make more money and avoid risk. So even people who are very well trained would have a difficult time doing that. Okay, so it's just a hard problem, and the quality of the decision will depend on your skills involved. So if you have less ability, that's where decision-making ability, you'll make choices of lower quality. That's a natural interpretation. And it certainly makes sense that some decisions would be better than others. Everything else comes in at varying levels of quality. Why wouldn't choices come in varying levels of quality? It makes sense that some people are better at making decisions than others. Again, people vary on every dimension. The central question, I think, is what do you mean by better? What is a better choice? How do we tell if someone tends to make lower quality decisions? That's the challenge, and the way we frame that challenge is basically with two problems. One is an identification problem. How do you distinguish differences in decision-making ability from what you might think of as the standard but unobserved explanations for heterogeneity in choice? How do I know if you've made a lower quality decision because you have low ability, or you just face different constraints? You have different preferences than I expected. You have different information than I thought you had, or you have different beliefs than I thought you should. How do I tell the difference? Okay, that's a central challenge. Even if you could fix this, how do you want to measure it? In the sense, how do you want to define better? Okay, so these are sort of twin problems. Okay, So what do? So we have to take a stand. We're going to do something. This is what we do. So we're going to measure decision-making quality by the consistency of choices with economic rationality. I don't want to argue that this is ideal, but it has some nice features. Okay. So what does it mean to be consistent with rationality? It means, if you're not consistent with rationality, there's no utility function that can rationalize your set of choices. And I want to add already, get this out of the way, no deterministic utility function, no deterministic choice function, in other words, a noiseless choice rule, could rationalize the set of choices. And then if that's true, I'm going to say they're not of high quality because they lack an objective. I don't care what the objective is, but I just want you to have one. Okay, so if decisions don't reflect an objective, then I'll say they're of lower quality. How do we evaluate that? We're going to present people with a choice experiment where we can measure that quality with precision. It has the advantage that it has an economic interpretation that's portable across domains, and we've shown that. This is in some ways how we address the measurement problem. The experiment holds beliefs and information constant within subjects, as long as you don't think that those are evolving over a very short period. And it controls for the relevant constraints. We influence them directly. So this is how we address the identification problem I posed. Because how do I know that your decisions are of low quality when it could just be you have different preferences, or you have different constraints that I don't observe, or you have different information that I don't see. Okay? So that's how we, in this sort of laboratory setting, it should be lab in quotes, that's how we address what we call the identification problem. It's an experiment. And this is, I think, especially relevant for this conference. I think the interest in decision-making quality that has been, I think, emerging in economics over the past 10 or 15 years, it's obviously mostly due to the possibility that there's some reflection of decision-making ability that is important for behaviors outside of a laboratory setting. And so what we're going to do, and we've done it now a few times, is implement this experiment with large and diverse samples of subjects in different countries. Armin, I was proud of myself until about 5 minutes ago. We've done the Netherlands and the United States. Not too impressive.
We'll see if Armin applies. We'll see if he'll apply.
So we can implement these in web-based surveys that exist. We're just piggybacking on existing methods. And then study the relationship between decision-making quality in these experiments and observable characteristics and behavior. Okay, so I'll show you something. I'll just talk very briefly, give an overview of what this task is. Okay. So it's not always the same. We've done it at several different venues, but this is the basic structure of it. You're going to face maybe 25, actually in some cases we've done hundreds of these independent decision problems. The typical one now in a large survey is implemented with 25 to 50 independent decision problems. And each problem is here, choose a bundle. Okay, in the simplest one, it's always, a bundle consisting of two different goods, and we call them X and Y from a budget line, or from a budget set, otherwise described. So what is X, what is Y? Sometimes it's a risky portfolio. So do you want some amount of payoff in the event of a heads or a tails? It's that kind of problem. Sometimes X is income sooner rather than later. Sometimes X is more money for you as opposed to someone else, so a social preference. There can be many different kinds of things. Okay? And you're going to just choose that from a budget line, and I'll show you a picture in a second. Sometimes we use other interfaces, but that's the typical one that we've used so far. And these budget lines, in other words, the relative prices of these forms of consumption, either sooner or later, in the event of heads or tails, these commodities, the prices of them, relative prices of them, will vary a lot. Okay? So this is what really distinguishes this setting from the real world. And economists have tried to do similar things with observational data for a long time. A challenge there is when you go, I'm trying to see if your bread choices are consistent with rationality. The price of bread just doesn't change enough over short periods of time for me to observe the kinds of violations of rationality that would indicate low quality decisions. Okay? This is more detail. Probably Okay, this is what an interface looks like. This is for the Dutch speakers in the world, in the room. This is the one of them that we implemented in the Netherlands. And you just use a cursor, this is over a computer, to move on this budget line. So this is the red asset, this is the blue. And if you chose this and, you know, the event of heads, you would get 40 tokens. And if it came up tails, you get 22.7. So in this example, this is the cheaper asset. Yeah? It's cheaper to consume this one as opposed to that one. In a different setting, if it were a choice over time, this would be like a very high interest rate. It's very cheap to postpone consumption to this future date relative to this sooner date, just as an example. Okay? So, and this line will vary all over the place. And you'll face 25 choices like this. I'm anticipating, probably what you're wondering. It's like, how do people make these kinds of decisions? The first few are made with a lot of care. They take time with it. And then it tends to be quite rapid afterwards. I've done it many times myself. I get pretty bored. But once you've got a rule in mind, it tends to go quite quickly. So that's what we've seen. I'll talk about one particular study in some detail. This is with the center panel. That's an internet panel of about 2,000 households, 5,000 individuals. It's meant to be representative of the Dutch-speaking population in the Netherlands. We've also implemented it with similar studies in the United States. Okay. So a little bit of sort of background on this, the theory of rationality in economics. So this is, we're going to look for consistency with something called GARP, the generalized axiom of real preference. And due to After we know that if you satisfy GARP, there exists a utility function to rationalize your choices. That's what we find interesting about the test, is that, do you have an objective? Is there something that you're trying to do with your choices? Okay? And so how you measure it, at least in one example of this, is as follows. So how do I know that you violated rationality? Well, you faced a budget line like this, okay? So in this case, this asset, this good, was cheap, okay? And when this good was cheap, and you had whatever money you had to spend, you chose this bundle. That's a little bit odd, honestly. So you're trying to choose a bundle between X1 and X2, and you chose this one that's kind of heavy, relatively speaking, on X1, even though X2 is really cheap. That's a little bit odd. And then when the prices equalized a bit, you went the other way. A little bit strange, honestly. It's not crazy necessarily, but it's a little strange. The prices evened out, and you ended up actually choosing Y. And fortunately, this should strike you as a little bit odd, and our test would say it is odd. It's odd because you chose X when Y was available, and you chose Y when X was available. That's a violation in this setting of transitivity. So this is an example where we can't find a utility function to rationalize your choices, period. Okay? So we say, okay, fine. You either violate this normative statement, do you have preferences or not? You either violate it or you don't. And we're going to ask you 25 choices, either violate it or you don't. That's not super helpful for quantitative research. Okay? So we look for so-called goodness of fit measures to say how close to rationality are you. There are lots of them now. Okay? And one of them that we like is this, due to After it's the critical cost efficiency index. It just basically says, how much would I have to bring this budget line in to get rid of that violation? So the violation says, oh, wait a minute, you chose X when Y was available, but then when X was available, if I bring this in, Y is no longer available. Okay, so the violation is gone. That means bringing in this budget set by this much. Alternatively, I could bring this budget set in by this much and get rid of the violation. I'll choose the more conservative of them. In other words, the smaller. Okay? And if I normalize this endowment, this amount of money that you have to spend, I can put that as a number between 0 and 1. That's our measure of rationality. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You could choose how many violations do you make. You could choose what's the largest set of choices out of 25 that is consistent with rationality. Stuff like that. It doesn't really seem to matter in these data. Okay? So again, this is a number between 0 and 1, where 1 is perfect consistency with rationality.
Can you find the time frame?
Yeah. In the Dutch data, we don't, with respect to risk. So by time you mean the choices in the, yeah. With risk, I've never seen it in any studies that we've done. With time, you do. I don't know why. So in other words, intertemporal choices, if you exclude the first 5, let's say, maybe 10, it's very consistent afterwards, and then but not so much with in the beginning. So I don't know. But it is.
So it's not about learning.
Not in risk. In time preference, it may be that people it takes them longer to get used to it. They are different.
First 5 or 10, and they take the same time to decide?
No, they don't.
No.
They don't. So there's 2 separate issues. The first is to say that in different domains, there seems to be different rates of what might naturally be interpreted as learning. So the rates of violation of GARP decrease as you move forward in the decision process for time preference. I haven't seen it in risk
The
preference.
response time is...
Response time in almost everything decreases,
Okay.
but it's like a step function.
Now the 2 tasks are almost comparable, so it should be almost... So
Time
is the response time in risk and time preference?
Oh, overall?
different?
Not within group, no. Across groups, you see big variations. So we have a study in the U.S. with
No, we do the same thing.
no, they're very similar patterns. Slow up front, quick at the end. But the big difference between risk and time is slow up front doesn't seem to lead to very many violations in risk, but in time it seems to. So this is a number between 0 and 1. There is no natural metric to say what is big, what is small. You can just do comparisons across. One observation is that large fractions are perfectly consistent with rationality. You don't want to necessarily salute that on its own. One way to be perfectly rational is to always choose blue, put everything in blue. So if you went back and just said, every time I'm locating here, that would make you perfectly consistent with rationality. It's not a great choice in any circumstance. Okay. Large fractions are always consistent, but there's lots of variation, and this is just some provocative differences by gender and age. Age we're exploring in some detail. It's very consistent across all the studies that we've done that rationality declines in a very interesting way with age. It tends to kind of decline slowly, and then in people in their sort of roughly in the early 50s, it kind of drops fairly sharply, and then flattens again. So a natural kind of concern is that this is some kind of cohort effect, it's not an age effect.
Do you find a correlation between risk tolerance and rationality?
Some, yeah. It depends what you mean by that. So obviously,
It would be rational to risk tolerance for small states.
I see. That, yeah, so if,
It's almost impossible because those who are not can be consistent as well.
I know what you're saying. So if I use and I'll show you a little bit of this, if we use a sort of summary, not a parametric measure of risk tolerance, what I would have thought is my prior is actually the opposite is true. So if in these pictures you're locating in the interior a lot, that's actually a very good sign for a bunch of things. So just to sort of fill in this conversation a little bit, every economist you would ever meet for these kinds of states, which are fairly low, would say always locate here. They'd always say, put all your money. Look, like these are not big states, but what's your problem? Just maximize expected value. Don't worry about risk. Don't locate in here and say, well, what if it comes up tails, what if it comes up heads? Like, look, you're going to face 1 million of these very small lotteries in life. Maximize expected value. I think this is what you're saying. In fact, in everything that we've looked at so far, this is not to say it's absent. There are some, sort of very high cognitive functioning people who always do that. They say, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing. On average, actually locating in the middle is a good sign. In other words, if you're looking for evidence of smarts or income, etc., it's actually the opposite of what I would expect. Okay, so lots of heterogeneity in this measure, and we're just going to, long story short, correlate that heterogeneity with observable characteristics in the world, and also run a few horse races, which I hope will be of more interest to the wider group. Run a few horse races with alternative measures. Now this is just more, this is, you don't see the age, but so this is with respect to age You don't see the horizontal thing because we're not controlling for things, but it tends to just sort of have this step. And these are fairly large differences in this rationality measure. I'm going to skip over that. So let's just take one example of an outcome. Okay, so we're going to exploit the fact that this survey was integrated, this experiment was integrated with a large survey with lots of other information about people. Let's just take one thing that economists tend to care about. This is a little bit like what Armin was interested in. Yeah.
So a question of design. Have you ever let people go back and redo the earlier answers as they've gone forward?
No. I mean, there's a little
That
bit.
might be interesting in terms of whether there is kind of a learning effect. I kind of wasn't early on sure what the question was.
Yeah.
Now I figured it out. I got my algorithm. I'd like to go back and review it.
There's another, I think there's a related question that I'm really interested in, and it would be great to get other people's reactions, which is, I would like to ask people to repeat. In other words, I want you to, let's not make it 25, let's make it 10. And I'm going to tell you, okay, now that you've done those 10, I'm going to give you those same 10 choices or menus. Please replicate what you just did. It's a different phenomenon, but here's the idea behind it, which I mean, it'd be interesting if people say this is absurd. I think we're catching some of that already.
No, I mean, I think that's something that is, literally going wrong in a lot of experiments is that people don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, so I think it'd be
People
really.
bet against themselves last time. They can't figure it out.
I think it might be really informative. But are you using a simple rule? If you're using a simple rule, whether you literally remember what you did or not, you can replicate it. Or if you just know what, in some sense, if you know what you did, you know what you were doing, you not literally remember, but this is what I do when I face these prices, then you can really replicate very closely. I think that'd be, as a measure,
How do you have this information in the data? Do you have the history of what they know on the frontier, or among the cursor?
oh yeah, how they adjust, you could look at that, that's right. We've
So
used that a
that
little
should,
bit.
I would expect that to be informative. If someone, I would start from the top, go down, see where I'm happy, explore a little bit more, and then go down.
Yeah, but that's definitely the case again in those first three kinds of choices. First four, first five, people are, they're really thinking. And what's interesting is, if you looked at time spent total on the experiment itself and say, okay, that must be correlated with something, that must be correlated with rationality. I think, many people in this room probably realize that's not. Because if you're good at something, you're quick. And it's just, even within periods, saying, oh, now I got it. I don't need to mess around with this thing very carefully. I've got it. I know what I'm doing.
So the later stages will start from the middle?
Oh.
They explore very little?
So we randomize the location of the cursor, and then they have to move it. But in later rounds, they're very quick. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of the external relevance kind of question. This is an experiment. In theory, it makes sense to us that, again, where the logic is, I want to call your decisions low quality if they don't seem to have an objective. I don't care what the objective is, I just want you to have one. It's kind of a low bar. Let's examine one outcome of interest, which is wealth, and this is again related to what Armin was talking about. It's not obvious that having more wealth is a good thing. It means if you have more wealth in many circumstances, that means you've spent less. Okay? Especially conditional on a bunch of stuff, like household income, etc. It's not obvious that this is a good thing. This is really just a question of whether this measure is related to other things. We're going to push a little bit harder in a minute to say, well, does it look like these are actually low quality decisions that resulted in having less wealth? And the answer is, you get a very large and statistically significant relationship between this measure of rationality in the experiment and liquid assets plus housing in the real world, which was kind of shocking, honestly. I did not expect this.
So that's an individual level correlation. Is this the household? This is the 3 people in the household average?
So the wealth is treated at the household level, in large part because wealth is very difficult to measure, and it makes sense. But this is the rationality of this financial respondent. So there's a financial respondent in the household, and we're just using his or her performance on the task.
Okay, and that's an actual Pearson correlation that we're looking at there?
Yeah, that's equivalent to one.
That's huge.
It's gigantic. I mean, it's too big, honestly. It's too big.
But I just, so the thing that has kept me going back again into surveys again and again is the shocking, here's what could make sense. Oh, look, it just happened. Like, why did that keep happening? It just does. And I found this in a number of, you ask questions of, thinking about planning, right, do you plan? And if it let me down, it doesn't just go straight through to the variable you were interested in economic terms. I think it's, and this is, the amazing findings, they just keep going back to the wall.
So the happy, I think it's right, Andrew. I think ex post, I'm happy with this. I think it's really interesting. But ex ante, I was kind of hoping for better performance of preferences. I mean, you see, they don't do so hot. So I think it is a bit of a mixed bag. The other good news here is so my former colleague at Michigan, Charlie Brown, would say, if you run enough regressions, one of them is going to break your heart. We haven't experienced that with it. It's hard to beat this guy down. It seems like it's really capturing something important, and I say that not just because of what we saw here, but because of what we've seen across a variety of data sets. It seems like it's something real. I don't know what it is, of course. We have a theory of what it is, but I think it needs much greater explanation.
Yeah, but coming to the theory, we did some theories.
Yeah.
We found it's really intelligence.
So
it's really.
that's the violations of monotonicity, right?
Yeah. So I see that and I say, yeah, sure. Intelligence is affected. Both.
Yeah.
That's the theory.
Yeah, I think that's fine. That's just too simplistic, though. I mean, obviously, first of all, in this room we can't say
We
intelligence.
should do everything as simple as possible.
But have you considered that just doing like the rate matrices test with these guys inside?
Yeah, we've implemented it. I don't have those results here, and they're.
I don't find this graduates where people are doing
But if you think, well, we are measuring, it's a way of measuring intelligence.
Perhaps. That's a very reasonable hypothesis. I think the evidence here is more
I'm sure
complicated.
there is an independent quality, which I think is not.
Okay.
It's maybe ability to introspect.
Yeah, again, this is not a simple correlation, obviously. There's a lot, and look, we all know there's lots of heterogeneity within education, within income, et cetera, within age. There's lots of heterogeneity in intelligence. I'm with you. There's just, when we try to condition on other things, and we have the Ravens matrix in this new sample, so we'll use that. It's clearly something different from the Ravens matrix. It's clearly something different. It's not independent. It's clearly something different from, anyway.
Can I add something which I think is really important?
This response is, I think, totally understandable. It's like, oh, it's smarter people. The key issue here is there is no right answer to these questions. And that's what I like a lot. Okay, so there's no endogenous source. I mean, that's not to say that that this is independent of resources, et cetera, or native intelligence.
But it's probably correlated with consistency over time. If you take the same choice and you see how many times you choose the same thing,
Yeah, so that
goes, this is close to being the right answer. Right? If you are consistent with yourself.
That sounds like another interesting hypothesis, yeah. And then why? So, why is it, if that were true, if it is very highly correlated with simple consistency of choice over time, like the kind of experiment that I'm interested in, so what? What does that mean? So is it that you're using a simple rule? Is it that you remember what you... So I think it's an interesting... You say, oh, it's just smart. That doesn't resonate with me.
No. Smart means that you have a well-established procedure and you follow it.
Oh, okay. I know a lot of smart people don't have well established.
Can you break down some of the decision process more frankly? In other words, there are different aspects, right? Perception, decision, processing information. These are very different decisions that we're talking about. Exactly. Now this table, but I mean, if you think more generally, when you go back over these different choice steps, I don't know how do we think about risk aversion, for example? Do you think that that's related to your ability to make forecasts about the future, about maybe it's intelligence? I'm just asking where the literature's at in terms of thinking, in terms of the decision process, what the rules might be. Or are there always heuristic processes that we can talk about?
Right.
I'm just wondering if these experiments support
can say is, we can, and this is a, horribly incomplete response to things. So we can separately, estimate, even non-parametrically, risk preferences, for example.
Right.
And if you want to perceive that as something different, that we can examine the relationship between your ability to have preferences and a non-parametric, estimate of your risk attitudes. Those are separate, those are distinct, and we can look at their correlation. I don't think that's a great answer to what you're asking, but that's part of what we're doing. You could also say, well, can I write down a simple heuristic model and estimate it, and again examine its relationship to this measure. We can do that too.
I'm just wondering if anyone kind of emerged, some decision-making heuristics might have emerged from this, and sort of come up with a consistent pattern of responses across different choices.
Within person, absolutely.
So, but you can just look at these data, you can see that people do wildly different things. They're not that they're crazy,
Right.
but some people implement Cobb Douglas in a way I can't even believe. I mean, it's just amazing how good they are at doing it. And other people are always choosing blue. I mean, that's a heuristic. But it's a wide variety of behaviors that you can
So
observe.
it's not like a few,
Not in my
each
experience.
story, each person is a different story.
Well, I mean, not entirely, but if you want to understand the extremes of this, the people who do really well and are consistent, that's one end. If the people who do really badly but are consistent in terms of expected value, that's another end. People who are completely confused.
So can I throw in two things? One is I'm willing to wager a excellent bottle of single malt whiskey on conscientiousness.
Yeah, exactly. It's like totally not.
So that's number one.
Okay, so
Well, you can be a conscientious dope.
sorry, you already got it. Sorry, did everyone see the hand gesture?
What is the bet?
That was the
A bottle of single malt whiskey.
I'm betting too that intelligence speaks for itself.
You gotta be a man, you gotta stand for
That's not a true bet, so I won't take your malt. I already knew the answer. And this is obviously so standardized means standardized by two. So this is conscientiousness. I'll apologize. This is probably horrible, but they implement 10 questions each related to the Big Five. You guys, do you know the center panel at all? It's not super familiar. Anyway, they do it.
So it's a 10-item.
And we just normalize it to have mean 0, standard deviation 1. That's what this means. Standardized, conscious, it's often missing. So this is just to preserve some sample, that's all. So we just need a dummy in there for it being missing. This is just one thing. I don't want to say, it's not super well correlated. It's positively correlated, but not, it's not crazy. What do you mean? I don't. So.
Some people have less than the one. I mean, how is it measured?
Oh yeah. So this is. So this is the Netherlands, and so liquid well relative to say the United States. So the United States has this modest liquid well period, but relative to the United States, this is, as a fraction of your total well, in the Netherlands it will be smaller because of the importance of public pensions and private pensions. Okay. So a lot of this will be housing. The pension is not there. That's right.
So it's essentially whether you own a house.
That's too strong. But it's a lot of it. Do you own a house? Where is that house located? Of course, it'll be influential. But the main variation is housing and just liquid assets.
So maybe that is a move to try to think about what does it actually mean to be high.
Good. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's right. The thing is, I would say. I'd be more concerned about the particulars. So wealth measurement is a problem. Okay. I'd be more concerned about the particulars of this particular finding, except we've seen it in a lot of other financial decision making. So in the United States, the accumulation of expensive credit card debt, delinquency, etc. So I think you're right to be concerned about that, or just be interested in it. But in terms of financial decision making, it seems kind of broad. Yeah.
And Can I just quickly follow up? So is this the correlation with your measure or the correlation with your criterion?
So what you see here.
I'm just trying to understand what the 09 there means.
Yeah, thanks. So this continues to be a correlation with wealth, conditional on age, education, a bunch of sort of standard stuff, and income. So it's a partial correlation. And the question that we were interested in is, how does this coefficient change on our measure? This is gigantic. This is not a Pearson correlation. This is not a simple correlation, but it's still, it represents a standard deviation increase in the scores related to, I don't know, like 15, 16% more wealth. It's gigantic. Okay? So so there's lots of interesting things here, but this is saying that conscientiousness as measured in this particular thing is positively correlated with wealth. The statistical significance is modest when you condition on all this other stuff. There's also a lot of missing variables that also have predictive value, as people have mentioned. The main thing is that with respect to wealth, conditional on all this other stuff, it's kind of orthogonal. It's just a different thing, which I think is really interesting and surprising.
Maybe you said, but how does this measure relate to other measures? Like, so in one of the US panels, in the Standing America panel, like I've been looking at this measure of consistency in risk perception. So they asked about, it's also like a task where they ask them, what is the probability that this event will happen? And then along the survey, they ask, what is the probability that the inverse event happen? And the probability to adapt 100. Or they ask, what is the probability that this happens in 1 year versus 5 years? And people should not say. So I look at that one, and that one is mostly conscientiousness.
Is it? Okay.
Is it and cognitive ability? So once you find correlations with wealth, but once you control for conscientiousness and for cognitive ability, already demographics disappear.
Okay, so that's really interesting because I think to me that's fascinating and really
And it's very
worth
much
pursuing with
correlated
respect to
with
this.
conscientiousness.
So again, of course I'm filtering it through my own bias, but what I really like about this is there's no right answer. Okay?
Yeah.
You can really be a pretty goofy decision maker and be consistent, from a normative perspective, and still be consistent with Darwin. And moreover, I think the experimental demand on this it's less obvious, I think. Just, make a choice. What's the right choice? What's right? I don't know.
Yeah, and we also made a method of carriers answers based on other items.
Right.
And it correlated with this consistent, but the carriers answer was more predicted like this one.
I see, okay.
So I wonder,
There's other stuff here too. So this is going to the disappointment that I had about risk preferences relative to this. So again, the relationship between risk preferences and wealth is not immediately obvious, but just the basic question is, if we use a reduced form measure from the experiment of risk preferences, it is, correlated but not very strongly with wealth in these data. And the qualitative measures, which is similar to what Armin was talking about, that does very poorly, conditional on other variables.
It seems like that you actually now can start, I really like the idea of getting 6 different types of error.
Yeah.
And maybe decomposing. For example, some of it might be a visual error. Some people might be very good at visual translation, so the different parts, the same choice, they might be different. But then you have to think that the same problems were impacting their answers to the risk aversion question. So that whatever you estimated to be the style of that error making in the dark case or the probability case, that might have a common factor with the fact that they're now misstating in some way the measurement error in their risk assessment, because any question you pose to them,
Very good.
Silent throws in.
So that's really to me the practical import of this kind of thing in a very specific way. How do I draw inference from other choices on a survey using this? You might think of this as kind of meta, I don't know if that's the right word, but metadata on the actual choices. You have information about how they made these choices that's kind of distinct from the, the expected value, the risk, et cetera, and then how could you use that to inform an additional decision? So this is really mostly what I wanted to say. There's one other one, which I hate this task. So this is called the cognitive reflection test. So it's just 3 questions.
Why do you do?
Because I do really badly on it. It's painful.
Just because you're impatient.
It's painful to me. So this is, if people know what this is, it's super powerful predictor of lots of stuff, and it's just, I find it personally painful. So it's like a bat and a ball together cost $1.10, and the bat, so the bat is $1 more than the ball, or something, I mean, something like that. So what's the price of the ball? 10 cents, right? Whatever. That's what I would say. That's not right. It does. So this, I think, this is as close as we have in these data to Theodore's question. They're correlated. It soaks up a lot of it, but it's different. But look, this is a 3-question thing, and obviously I'm super intelligent and do really bad. Okay. So this is just a taste. Okay. This is just. It seems to do really well with financial decision making in predicting not just, of course, behavior within the experiment, but also outside. I just showed you one. We have a bunch of other things. We have choice over time with the same data in the Netherlands. This is really intriguing to me, but anyway, we can talk about it later. We have this different panel in the Netherlands, which much greater information on health. And that's where we're exploring in some depth this relationship between consistency in the experiment and age. And the central question, the central question we have there is this a cohort effect? Is it just, look, older people are not that familiar with using computers, and that's what we're doing here. And so we have some simple tasks to say, can you implement very specific portfolios? And ask, well, does that explain the lack of rationality or the lower rates of rationality among older people? Or is it something like declining health or natural aging? So far, what we've seen is that it does not look like a cohort effect. These are people who are they're in an internet survey. They're good at computers. They may be, computers may have been relatively new to them, but they're doing fine. Understanding America study. This is a U.S. panel. Did we talk about it already? Anyway, this is Ari Kaptein's most recent web-based survey, very sophisticated set of questions on a lot of things. We implemented it there, and there we get some task information, very similar portfolio choices, but implemented in different ways. And this, I think, goes to the question, like, is it a visual component? Is it very particular to the kinds of interfaces that we have been using so far? There's some evidence that they aren't the same. There is differences across. So this is within individual different tasks. Some evidence that the actual implementation of these choices does matter. What else do we got? American Life Panel. This is Ari Kaptein's previous one.
Dealing with 3 of his evidences.
Yeah, exactly. That's all we do. Is that whatever Ari Kaptein does, we follow. Looking at social preferences and voting behaviors in that one. Medical students have been implemented and using this kind of method to elicit their preferences, and then look at what kind of specialization they choose. Is it are they mean neurosurgeons or nice family doctors? This is just published in Science. The survey, you might have seen it, the survey of Yale law students. So, people from the Yale law students are like, if you're the best student in the world and you don't get into the University of Chicago's graduate program in economics, you go to Yale Law School. So it's the second best. And then the question is, how do you compare their social preferences, their rates of rationality to, even Berkeley undergrads, who are obviously very bright, very talented people. These guys kill them. Their scores are much higher. And then the separate question was, how do their social preferences differ among these elite? Lots of different stuff. These have been implemented in many different places. So it'd be great if there were additional insights that we could bring to this agenda and also to export to yours. So any ideas you have along those lines would be great. Thank you.